The Act for Change Together Festival is a series of exciting online events that will showcase the worth and power of young people making meaningful change. The Act for Change Together Festival comes out of the combined drive and passion of 32 organisations across the UK, supported by Act for Change Fund, that believe young people are the future and have the power to lead change. So welcome everyone to the first podcast of the series. My name is Acushla and I am the UK Projects Manager at a charity called Irise International. We are all about empowering girls and women and people with periods across the UK and also in East Africa. And we have been working with Act for Change to empower young people across the UK to lead their own advocacy and activism projects relating to period equality. So just so you know, that's who I am. I'm based in Sheffield, that's where I'm calling from. And period equality, just to kind of explain it a little bit, is basically when everyone who has a period and everyone who menstruates is able to live a life that they cherish and that they value themselves, and that they are able to reach their full potential and thrive in a society in which we live. So today we're going to be talking a bit about the work of Irise, but also how we engage people who don't really want to listen to us and don't really want to talk to us. And to do that, I have two amazing guests, which is Sophie and Nikki. So I'll pass over to them to introduce themselves.
Sure. Thank you, Acushla. So I'm Sophie. I live in Sheffield, and I first joined Irise about 3 years ago as part of the Agent of Change programme. And I was initially motivated by my own experiences of menstruation and puberty. And then through the Agent of Change programme, I kind of learned a lot about the key issues in menstrual health and the issues, the kind of diversity of menstrual experience that kind of beyond my own experience, and got really fantastic training and mentorship that kind of really built my confidence in trying to address those issues. And so I subsequently joined Irise's Board of Trustees, and that's a volunteer governance role. And in that role, I particularly work with our Empower Period network on developing youth-led advocacy for menstrual equality. So I'm really excited to be here on the podcast and to talk about this, I think, really pertinent question of how we engage with people with whom we disagree.
Yeah, so like Sophie, I started volunteering with Irise around the same time in 2018, I want to say. And I also partook in the Agent of Change programme. At the time, I was a student in Sheffield, and the programme for me was a really enlightening and interesting experience and a change from volunteering experiences I'd had prior. So after that, I became a member of the Friends of Irise student group, who organised events such as Moonrise, which was quite well known amongst the student population in Sheffield, and it was so much fun to plan and attend, and it was all for a good cause. And Irise definitely uses innovative ways like this in their fundraising and problem solving, and that's one of the reasons I still want to be involved today, including involvements with a forum despite moving away from Sheffield after finishing uni last summer.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you for that glowing review of Irise as well. So basically what we're going to be talking about in this session is, as Sophie said, how do we engage with people who disagree with us? How do we talk to people who don't quite meet eye to eye with what we think and what we value and what we say? And I think in terms of how Irise handles that, I think we're quite well versed in talking to people who disagree with us, not just in terms of what we think about women and girls and people with periods, but just actually being able to enter a conversation to talk about periods in the first place is really difficult. So before we even kind of say our views and our opinions and what we see happening in the world, just to be able to actually say that, you know, periods and menstruation is on the agenda is a barrier in itself. So we're going to be talking a bit about sort of our experiences of that. And I kind of like to start by passing it over to Sophie and Nikki to talk about their own experiences of engaging people who disagree with you, whether that's in the period equality movement or not. But yeah, Sophie, do you want to take it away?
So I think periods are a really good sort of issue or topic to kind of orient this conversation around, because in the UK context and lots of other places globally as well, menstruation is often this kind of taboo topic that isn't really talked about publicly. So I found that when you do bring it up, whether it's in the context of I'm talking about my own period, or I'm talking about my period cramps, or describing the work that I do with Irise around period poverty and period shame, you find that sometimes people kind of want to shut down the conversation. And sometimes that'll be because they've sort of been socialized to believe that this is something that we shouldn't talk about. Or sometimes people who don't menstruate kind of think this topic just isn't relevant to me. And then sometimes, which I think can be particularly challenging, is where you encounter people who are actually quite kind of defensive or annoyed at the idea that periods are something we should be addressing. For example, we'd argue that people should be able to access like free materials to manage their menstrual bleeding. And I've heard arguments against that, kind of along the lines of sort of why should people who menstruate get, tampons and pads given to them for free when they only cost X amount, and when there's other things such as kind of razors for facial hair or something aren't given to people for free. And I think there's kind of a few things going on in that kind of response, which is firstly sort of an underestimation of how widespread the problems of period poverty and shame are. I think they're often seen as sort of historical problems, when in fact they're very much contemporary things that haven't yet been kind of solved. And so, for example, Plan International found that 3 in 10 girls in the UK struggled to afford or access menstrual products during the COVID-19 lockdown. And also nearly half of girls are embarrassed about their periods. So that's, those are not issues that have already been solved. And then secondly, I think when you hear these sort of comparisons between menstrual products and things such as razors, it reveals this sort of perception that menstrual products are non-essential, and that people who are calling for period equality are actually calling for menstruators to kind of get special treatment. Like, an underlying thing that's going on there is this quite common misconception of equality, where you have an idea that equality is about everyone being treated exactly the same, regardless of their circumstances and needs. And that kind of leads to this idea that when you're arguing for free menstrual products, or for people who menstruate to get leave from work when they're on their period, that it's as though you're asking for menstruators to have this special treatment, and that's then kind of unfair on people who don't menstruate because they're not receiving these same things. Whereas actually these things, pads, education, facilities, they are essential healthcare. And as Acushla said in her kind of definition of period equality, these are things that menstruators need in order to flourish and participate in society. And they're actually kind of essential for correcting the existing power imbalances in society that already exist to disadvantage people who menstruate relative to those who don't. So I think in those kind of examples of the misconceptions that I've seen around period equality, usually what it comes down to is kind of a lack of understanding about the issues, because I think these are kind of complex issues. So I think if you kind of take people's attitudes with an assumption that they have kind of misunderstood or don't yet know enough, then I think that can be quite positive, because then it helps open up a dialogue where you can kind of help them understand the issue in more detail. Because so many of the issues surrounding menstruation in particular are sort of stemming from the silence around the issue, I think it's so important that we are willing to have these difficult conversations with people who disagree with us, because ultimately if we only ever kind of talk to people who already agree with us, then we don't actually help kind of shift collective ideas and social norms, and they just kind of remain static.
Hi, yeah, I'm just thinking of all the really good points you touched on. I think misconceptions is a really important one. And I think another misconception which comes about is this whole notion that it's not an issue which happens here. It's not an issue which is a UK issue. And I think with the way people justify that, it makes you feel further away from the issue. And sometimes it is almost just easier to ignore these things. Like we've seen the past year plus of a pandemic, and for so many different issues competing for attention, and all really need them, for so many different social issues which are going on internationally and locally. And again, with stuff like that, especially when it comes to harder times, people do often go to the whole argument of what about what's happening here and what about, but I think people often forget, or because of the lack of I wouldn't say lack of conversation, but not always publicized conversations around how pervasive these issues are. Like I volunteered with Irise for 3 years, like you, and like just seeing how close they are to you. Like there's people who are affected of issues of period inequality in Sheffield, like where we all became involved with Irise, and like up and down the country. But again, it often will come down to, oh, that can't be an issue here. And I think that's also an argument which kind of underpins the other ones. Like the issue can't be that bad here that people need free products. It can't be that bad here that people are really suffering. And then sometimes the mainstream narrative could be, I remember when I started volunteering, the whole narrative around like women spend £400 a year on periods. And like it's such a narrow one, because like it's not just a women's issue. It's not just women who menstruate, but also for people who are some of the most marginalized, to just spend 400 on your period isn't the type of scale of period inequality in this country that, oh, some people want some freebies because it's inconvenient to buy pads. It's about like the people who literally have no options and can't afford anything. I think what's really interesting about the misconception of it doesn't happen here is how well, like when you start the Agent of Change program or getting involved with Irise, how things like for quotes you get to look at between like whether it was said by people in Uganda or said by people here. And that always stuck with me because it really emphasizes how close the problem is to home, because you can't even tell the difference. And it's like, these are international issues, but again, they are local issues. There are young people in the UK who struggle to manage menstruation, and there are young people in the UK who struggle with the stigma, whether they menstruate or not. And I think with so many issues, like you have to embrace and acknowledge that they're going on. If you can't take ownership, or like policymakers here can't take ownership of what's going on, then how do you even get to the point where you start addressing it?
That's amazing. Thank you both for like all of your thoughts and opinions on that. I think one thing that's come to mind as you've been speaking is, where do you think the position of boys and men and those who don't have periods sits within this movement? Like, do you think that there is a space for those individuals? And I think it's an important thing to think about, especially within this conversation of how do we engage those who disagree with us? Because sometimes there's a question of how do we engage those who don't have any lived experience of the issue. And it'd be great to know what you both think about that, whether you've got sort of, permanent opinions, or whether you're just thinking from your heads right now. But yeah, Sophie, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is really important to engage with people who don't menstruate. And I suppose a few reasons for that is, firstly, everyone who menstruates interacts with people who don't menstruate on like a daily basis. So if we don't include people who don't menstruate in our kind of conversations and in our movement, then, and in menstrual education as well, then menstruation isn't something that everybody knows about and cares about. And then I think that creates the potential for some quite like harmful interactions to take place. So again, in Plan International's research, they found that 1 in 5 girls in the UK have been bullied about their periods. And their research heard about incidents such as a girl whose male classmate refused to sit next to her at school because he thought she was dirty because she was on her period. And that then obviously affects that girl's confidence and self-esteem in really kind of horrific ways. Whereas if you'd hope that if boys are included in this conversation about periods and they understood the issues, that they would treat their counterparts who are menstruating with much more respect and kindness. So I think that's an important reason for it. And then I think, so one thing that Irise works a lot on is about kind of shifting power structures and like who has a voice in society and that kind of thing, which is really, really important work. But I think equally, I suppose the current society that we live in involves the fact that lots of people who don't menstruate are often in positions where they are making decisions that directly affect people who do menstruate. So it is really important that they understand their needs when they're making those decisions. So I mean, for example, if someone who is like designing a public bathroom, you'd hope that if they're aware of the needs of menstruators and kind of have that very strongly in their mind when they're doing that design, they would be putting sanitary disposal bins in place. They'd be putting menstrual products there for free, and a sink that you can reach from a toilet so you can clean your menstrual cup if you use one, or thinking about how people with wheelchairs use this space and that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, that's another reason why it's important. And then finally, I'd say that as someone who menstruates, I think always having to advocate for yourself and be the one to like speak up and disrupt things can be like quite tiring and exhausting. So I think it's important to have other people who like stand by your side and also be willing to speak up, so that the burden isn't just on those who are like most affected by the issue. And like similarly, I think that's important in terms of sort of the diversity within the menstrual equality movement as well. So for example, like as I'm like personally, I'm like an able-bodied person who menstruates, and I use a menstrual cup, and I find that to be really great. But equally, when you hear sometimes arguments where people are kind of framing menstrual cups as like universally the best solution because it's, you know, good for the environment, I think, you know, I have a responsibility to like challenge that and disagree, because actually menstrual cups aren't universally great, because, you know, for some people with certain disabilities that affect kind of manual dexterity and that kind of thing, they can actually be quite difficult to use. So I think it's just really important that there is a diversity of voices within the movement and within the conversation. And I think, yeah, like mostly lived experience should probably most of the time come first, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily involves excluding people who don't have lived experience of periods.
The most important voices around these issues are those of the people who are really closely affected by them, but allyship is so important, especially with like some of the points that Sophie's already raised. But something like one thing which was coming to mind for me was like, even as someone who can menstruate, kind of similar to your point on cups and stuff, like someone who does menstruate, someone who means well and is interested in the issue and has tried to like work alongside other people to help play their part in addressing this issue. You don't have all the answers, and some of the answers will come from people who have different experiences of menstruating, but also those who don't are a part of the answer too. I think as well, to like look at such a privileged experience, or a relatively privileged experience of someone who like has access to the products they use, like Sophie, like things like a menstrual cup are convenient and accessible to me, alongside the things you need to use products like that, like clean water, privacy, and like just other facilities that you need to have them. You can't take that for granted. And to just look at one experience and then look at one solution coming out of that experience, and maybe say, like you could say menstrual cups are reusable and you can sterilize them, and they're easy, they're convenient, you only need one. That really doesn't take into account like all the other experiences and all the other challenges which come from like the other ways that people menstruate. So that's like another reason, like we need so many different types of people involved, and different people advocating, and different people sharing their challenges and also their approaches to solutions. I think unfortunately as well, such a big thing is the gap between those who are really dramatically affected and those who have increased power almost to address these things, and like those who are more empowered by wider societal structures. Like who would you think of when you think of who has the power and means to address period inequality? It's those who will decide on like how much money is allocated to tackling this issue. It's those who decide on what the example of bathroom infrastructure and stuff, like people who think about those who aren't like themselves. And unfortunately, those who are really, really intensely affected may not always have those means to address the issue, which is why it's important to have allies on board, and those who don't necessarily experience the issue understanding the issue, or at least sympathizing and like listening to those who do.
I agree with both of what you say as well. And I think with the sort of access to different products, it's not even about what works for you because of your situation. It's also about just like having the ability to choose. Like even if you are able to use a pad and a cup and a tampon, like whatever it might be, it's all about being able to choose what's right for you and like what's comfortable for you. And I don't think that anyone else can like take that decision away from an individual. Yeah, I think also just thinking of the original question about, you know, how do we want to engage boys and men and people who don't menstruate? I think kind of as you sort of touched on, Sophie, if we want periods to be mainstream, if we want periods to be existing in all parts of society, then everyone in all of those parts of society needs to know about them. Like that makes perfect sense, I think. So yeah, I think in terms of like how we handle it with advocacy and activism, there's definitely some interesting points that you've raised. One thing that I was wondering if Sophie, you'd like to speak about is kind of your experience of disagreement, how you deal with that at a sort of governance level rather than this sort of grassroots activism, and what your experience, especially as a young person, has been of that.
So I guess firstly I'd say that one thing that I really love about the menstrual equality kind of movement and the Irise community is that I suppose, as we were kind of touching on in the previous section, talking about how always advocating for this issue is like quite exhausting, particularly when you're coming up against people pushing back. And so being part of like a movement and a community is really, really valuable in that sense of like being part of a community of other people who also care about the same issue as you and who you can kind of work together with. I think that's really, really important. But I think it's important to kind of recognise that sort of disagreements about period equality don't only arise sort of between menstrual advocates and people who are entirely like unsympathetic or unaware of the cause, but disagreements and differences of perspective also arise kind of within the movement of people who are like actively working towards menstrual equality. And I think ultimately that's because, you know, there's no one universal experience of menstruation, and so there can be no like universal factual truth about menstruation or the best solutions to the issues the menstruators face. And ultimately, I think that's a really positive thing because it kind of enables us to learn. And I think one thing I really value about Irise is that as an organisation, we don't only facilitate young people to sort of challenge the status quo within their own communities, but also within Irise and within the menstrual equality movement. So for me as a trustee within Irise, I find that, you know, I'm kind of encouraged to disagree with the other people on the board and the other people in the organisation. And I think one of the things that kind of helps with that is firstly that, so I think in some other organisations and spaces that I've been part of, there's kind of this underlying assumption that the people in the most senior roles or who have the most kind of experience in terms of the amount of time they've been involved in something, for example, are like always right and always have the best ideas. Whereas I think in Irise, that perception doesn't kind of exist. I think whilst there's definitely like a respect for different you know, people who have like kind of basically I think we respect different kinds of expertise.
Yeah, so Sophie, it'll be really interesting to hear about your role as a young trustee on the Irise board, and how you've had to sort of engage with disagreements there and how you handle that and your experiences of that.
So I think, yeah, in other organisations and spaces that I've been involved with, there's often this underlying assumption that the person who kind of has the most years of experience or is in the most senior role or even, you know, the person who talks with the greatest confidence is always right. Whereas I think it's actually really powerful when we let go of that assumption. And that's something I found to be very sort of unique within Irise, in that I joined the Board of Trustees aged 23, I think, and was kind of at least 10 years younger than the kind of probably other youngest member of the board. And yet I found that my age doesn't kind of come into how my ideas are received by others. I think it's very much a space of different forms of knowledge and different kinds of expertise being made, like kind of there being space for that. And I suppose my particular role on the board is around kind of advocacy with young people, and that's kind of my area of expertise, whereas other people on the board bring other areas of expertise. And I think there's also other sort of organisational mechanisms that Irise use that really facilitate productive disagreement. So I think, for example, for multiple perspectives to be heard, it's often necessary to actively seek out those perspectives, because I think otherwise we can end up sort of just considering our own like perspective derived from our own frame of experience. So at Irise, we really regularly consult our wider community by doing surveys or holding public consultation meetings. And we gather a diverse range of people involved to gather a diverse range of views and experiences, so that for the most part, decisions aren't made by one or two individuals, but they're instead kind of co-created by a diverse group of people with a diverse range of experiences. And I think, and that kind of process is something that members from all different parts of the organisation are involved in. And I think that's really, really beneficial in informing the kind of decision making that happens at the board level, because I think that the board are quite well in touch with the perspectives of the wider beneficiaries and the wider network of Irise's supporters. And I think another thing that really helps at the board level is that I think sometimes where you have like a really strongly held perspective on something, this kind of strength with which you hold on to your pre-existing ideas can sort of obscure alternative ideas or even make you feel kind of defensive when someone disagrees. Whereas actually I think it's much more fruitful to go into conversations with a more open mind and being prepared to have your opinion shifted by listening to others. So for example, in board meetings, we often read papers before the board, and I'll generally sort of might kind of come up with an opinion on the right way to go about something, or even disagree with something that's been proposed. But then during a meeting, I'll hear someone else's different point of view and ask them questions so I can understand where they're coming from. And that will make me adjust my way of thinking. And that equally happens other ways for other people in the board as well. And I think that can only happen if you're open to it and you welcome disagreement and you're prepared to listen to others. And I feel very, very lucky to be part of a kind of governance space in which everyone sort of shares that attitude.
Brilliant, thank you, Sophie. I think I kind of have like really similar experiences to you in terms of touching on sort of diversity and inclusion. Diversity, I think, is something which is a lot more difficult than sort of mainstream media might have people believe. Like often I think diversity can sort of come from people thinking that they want everyone sort of in a room to look completely different and come from different backgrounds and different cultures, but ultimately they want everyone to have the same train of thought and they want everyone to have the same school of thought. And that isn't true diversity at all. Diversity is about, as you say, like having a lot of different people from different circumstances giving their thoughts and perspectives and insights. And then being able to kind of come to an agreement with all of those disagreements within that space. And I think something we talk about a lot is to make this kind of process fair and to make sort of engaging with those who disagree with us doable and achievable. It's about buying into the process rather than the outcome. So if you believe that the process in which you're having these discussions and having the open dialogue and you're making sort of democratic decisions, if you believe in that process and you think that that is just and fair, then you can't sort of really argue so much with the outcome, because it takes on board everyone's perspectives and opinions, and you're able to get to an end point where you believe in the process in which you took to get there. And I think that's a really useful tool within like managing sort of diverse spaces. But yeah, thank you so much for that, Sophie. That was really, really interesting. One thing that we wanted to kind of talk about also was someone called Minna Salami, who is a Nigerian and Finnish journalist, and she writes and speaks and advocates on a broad range of Africa, diaspora and feminist issues. She has an amazing TED Talk, which you can access online, where she tells powerful stories of how African women in the West do not represent the experiences of her own friends and family, and how very simply African women like the same things as women everywhere. And this is something that Sophie shared with the group here today. And we'd like to sort of play a little clip of her TED Talk to all the listeners, and then we'll sort of discuss what it is we think about it. So yeah, this is Minna, and this is what she has to say about sort of changing the world and changing your visions of the world to enable social change to happen.
I saw and continue to see representations of African women that did not reflect the reality of the women in my family or my friends or my colleagues. It became clear to me that rather than the complex reality of what it means to be an African woman, the media was saturated with one-dimensional portrayals of African womanhood. And I identified 3 major stereotypes, which I called the struggler, the survivor, and the stereotype-empowered African woman. The first, the struggler, she's the woman whom war, famine, and/or poverty has rattled. In media images, she's usually in despair, grieving, shouting, weeping. The second, she's otherwise identical to the first, only she has survived the struggle. In media representations, she usually smiles illustratively to demonstrate this point. But we're always aware that harsh conditions still surround her. The third, the stereotype empowered African woman, she is basically everybody else. She may be a politician or a policewoman or a baker or an artist, but media representations of her always hint at someone who has struggled, survived, or comes from a lineage of women who have struggled, survived, and only then are empowered. An African woman is hardly ever just a woman. She is hardly ever depicted doing mundane things, drinking a cup of green tea, or crafting, relaxing, reading, and above all, loving and being loved.
So that's the small clip that we wanted to play to everyone listening. And I think on first glance or first kind of listening of it, you might think that it's not too relevant to the conversation, but it really genuinely is. I'd really kind of like to pass over to Sophie to sort of explain why this particular engagement is important for discussing how to engage those who disagree with us, and why we want to talk about it in this space as well.
I definitely recommend everyone go and watch the full sort of 15-minute talk as well, because it's really, really great. So I think why I was drawn to this clip in the context of, this discussion that we're having today is that, so Mina Slami is kind of talking about how these reductive, one-dimensional portrayals of African women as, having lives entirely marked by suffering and struggling creates this sort of one-dimensional public and particularly kind of Western imagination or stereotype about African women, in which we then kind of struggle to imagine African women otherwise. And her point is not that, African women don't struggle and in some cases experience harsh conditions, but that this kind of really reductive picture denies their humanity as really much more complex people with complex lives and lives that are much more mundane as well. And obviously there's this particular lineage of patriarchy and racism bound up with, colonialism, which kind of accounts for that one-dimensional representation of African women that she's describing. And I think it's sort of relevant to this discussion in two ways. So I think firstly, touching on something that Nkechi talked about earlier about a misconception about period equality being that, period poverty is not an issue that we experience in the UK. And I think often that is actually stemming from this one-dimensional representation of Africa and African women, where it's all about struggle and suffering, we then make the assumption that period poverty is kind of a problem that we associate with African countries and not with the UK, which is obviously kind of problematic. But I think it's also just this broader point is pretty much true of anything, that when we're only exposed to one way of seeing something, we then take this to be like a full and universal picture when it's actually quite reductive. So to give a personal example, I suppose it's not actually related to menstrual equality, but I recently went to a really great exhibition at the Millennium Art Gallery in Sheffield called My Path. And it was of artworks done during lockdown by people in the criminal justice system. And these artworks were absolutely amazing, showing, so much talent and creativity. And I initially found myself feeling surprised that someone in prison could be a talented artist. And as soon as that thought kind of came into my head, I felt, really ashamed for having that thought, because of course, it shows quite a biased and prejudiced view. And I think I was thinking about it more and thinking, well, this probably comes from the fact that in general, in society, we're largely exposed to negative representations of people who are in prison and, see them being entirely defined by the fact that they're in prison, rather than seeing them as full and complex people with, diverse talents and interests and experiences. So I think that it's really important as individuals that we sort of actively seek out multiple different stories about people and places and issues, and resist adopting a one-dimensional or overly simplistic idea about something. I think pretty much any time we hear a one-dimensional idea about something, we should kind of be suspicious and think, hang on, what else might be going on there? And it's important to sort of be open to a constant evolution in our perspectives, because I think as we're exposed and actively seek out more information, our perspectives will inevitably always kind of change. And I think as well as there sort of being an individual responsibility to seek out those stories, there's also a responsibility for institutions, whether it's, charities or education providers or the media, to kind of project and make available those multiple stories and multiple truths. Because I think it's just not sufficient for the onus to only be on the individual to be accessing those things.
Just to add to what you said, I must admit, when you suggested the Mina video, I went and ordered her book. So I'm really excited to read that. I definitely agree with like what you said around the narratives and different narratives that different types of women have. I think I could definitely relate to this video as a woman with African heritage, but I can also see how, like, I grew up in the UK and like you are still disempowered as a woman here in different ways, and there's different disempowering narratives, such as like, and like again with the whole thing about it doesn't happen here. One thing I really love about Irise is how not only do they work with a woman in Uganda and show the shared experience of what's happening in South Yorkshire in the UK and what's happening in Uganda, but there's also like shared expertise and shared problem solving, and it's a mutually beneficial back and forth relationship, rather than Irise going in as this Western-based organization which knows all the answers. Like, you can definitely see that the way people in Uganda, whether it's the beneficiaries of Irise's work or the people working there, are equally valued. And I think that's so important, because when we have more of this empowerment and more of seeing everyone's value, then it leads to so many good outcomes, not just on how people feel and how people are treated. So yeah, this was such an interesting video for me, and like really was thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Sophie. And anyone who wants to go and look at it, it's really amazing. It's called Change the World, Change Your Illusions by Nina Salani. It's so great to have spoken with Sophie and Nikki about their experiences and getting the best advice. In part 2, we will be inviting Majid, ex-Mayor of Sheffield, MEP and activist, to join us to share his views. Find out more about all the other Act for Change Together podcasts at actforchangetogether.org.uk.